the preacher who built an empire, and the questions he couldn't outrun. What will you do with Jesus, who is called the Christ? It's a line he's repeated for decades, from a pulpit that eventually reached almost every corner of the globe. Over 60-plus years, one man built something few pastors ever come close to: a congregation of 20,000, a broadcast signal sitting in 99 million homes, and a shelf of books that landed on the New York Times bestseller list again and again. But empires like this don't stay quiet forever. Old sermons keep resurfacing at the worst possible moments. Donors have started asking pointed questions about where the money actually goes. And critics who held their tongues for decades are finally saying out loud what they've apparently thought all along. Now in his mid-80s, a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with sitting presidents is facing the kind of scrutiny he spent a lifetime managing to avoid. And depending on who you ask, what's surfacing now is worse than anything that came before. This is the story of John Hagee. Part 1. The boy who was never going to be just a preacher's son. John Charles Hagee entered the world on April 12, 1940, in Goose Creek, Texas, a gritty refinery town that would later be absorbed into Baytown, just outside Houston. He was the second of 4 boys born to William Bethel and Veda Hagee, and if there's one thing that defined his childhood before anything else did, it was the church. His family didn't just attend services. They built them. Both parents were immersed in Pentecostal ministry, and Hagee could trace preachers back through generations of his own bloodline. His father had planted Assemblies of God congregations in Channelview and Houston, before eventually taking the pulpit at Glad Tidings Assembly of God in Corpus Christi. For young John, there was no separating church from life. By age 5, the congregation already had a nickname for him: Johnny, the pastor's boy, the kid who stood up front and sang every single week. He grew up bouncing between the rigid structure of Pentecostal life and the ordinary rhythms of a small Texas town, while his parents ran First Assembly of God in the Channelview area. But John wasn't only shaped by sermons. He was shaped by competition. His father had zero interest in sports, but that never slowed the kid down. At Reagan High School in Houston, he built a reputation that had nothing to do with the pulpit: National Honor Society, varsity letters in 4 different sports, and eventually the captaincy of the football team. His grades were sharp, his leadership was obvious, and the payoff came in a form most teenagers can only fantasize about: an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Rank, discipline, a life mapped out in advance. It was all sitting right there waiting for him. And then, in a single night, none of it mattered anymore. It was the second Thursday of January, 1958. 17-year-old John was sitting on the back pew during a revival service at his father's Houston church, the same church he'd quietly planned to walk away from the moment he was old enough. He had sports. He had West Point. He had an entire future already sketched out. But when the altar call came that night, something in him broke open. By his own account, he felt a pull he couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. He got up, walked to the front in front of the entire congregation, and surrendered to what he believed was a call into full-time ministry. He wasn't even 18 yet, and the future he'd spent years building had just evaporated, replaced by something he hadn't planned for at all. He didn't wait around to make official. The very next morning, he withdrew from Reagan High School. Strong grades, a bright athletic future. None of it mattered enough to finish out the year. Within 2 days, he'd enrolled at Southwestern Bible Institute in Waxahachie, Texas, an Assemblies of God school that would later become Southwestern Assemblies of God University. While his old classmates were still worrying about prom and their senior season, Hagee was 250 miles away, unpacking boxes in a dorm room, about to spend his days buried in chapel services and theology courses. It wasn't glamorous. By the first Sunday of March 1958, barely weeks after enrolling, he delivered his very first sermon back at his father's Houston church. Not a youth talk, not a practice run. This was the real beginning of his public ministry. His week split into 2 lives: classes in theology during the week and traveling to preach at whatever small church would have him on the weekends. He joined the school's touring choir, singing his way through congregations across the region to help recruit for the college. And because none of that paid the bills, he took a job at a church furniture factory, building pews and pulpits by day, standing behind them by night. He wasn't even 20 yet, and he was already living on almost no sleep, stretched between labor, study, and the pulpit. Part 2. From the football field to the front of the church. Hagee didn't stop climbing. In 1962, after years of weekend preaching, he landed a full athletic scholarship to Trinity University in San Antonio as a football walk-on, meaning his education, for once, wasn't riding on theology at all. He earned a Bachelor of Science in History and Education there, graduating in the summer of 1964, all while continuing to build his identity as a young evangelist on the side. After Trinity, he pivoted, briefly, into coaching, taking a job at Nimitz Middle School in the Northeast Independent School District, where his football, track, and basketball teams all brought home district titles. For a moment, it looked like education and athletics might actually become his career, but the pull towards something bigger never let up. By the fall of 1965, he enrolled at North Texas State University to pursue a master's degree in educational administration, finishing it the following year. That detail matters more than it might seem. Most pastors of his generation stopped at Bible college. Hagee added a graduate degree in leadership and institutional management, training that would later show up in exactly how he built organizations, managed staff, and scaled a ministry far beyond the size of a typical congregation. Even while finishing those degrees, he never really left the evangelist circuit. Weekends on the road, sermons in unfamiliar towns, constant travel. It was an apprenticeship in performance as much as theology. It taught him how to read a room, how to build momentum inside a single sermon, and how to speak in a way that made people react, not just listen. Long before San Antonio knew his name, the revival circuit had already built the preacher he would become. Part 3. Building Cornerstone from nothing. By 1966, at just 26, Hagee was done traveling. He wanted to build something that would last. That October, he founded Trinity Church in San Antonio, his first congregation of his own. It was a real risk. He had a stable career in education behind him and a freshly minted master's degree. He chose to walk away from security anyway. Trinity Church grew fast. Within 6 years, the original building couldn't hold a crowd anymore, and by 1972 the congregation moved into a much larger sanctuary. Even that early, the pattern was obvious. Hagee wasn't interested in simply maintaining what he had. He wanted to keep building. Then came a decision nobody saw coming. In May 1975, less than a decade after founding Trinity Church, Hagee abruptly resigned as senior pastor. Instead of using that momentum to step into a bigger, more established platform, he did the opposite. He took over a struggling 25-member congregation in the San Antonio suburb of Castle Hills. He stripped away its old identity and renamed it the Church at Castle Hills. On paper, it looked like a demotion. In reality, it became the foundation for everything that followed. His personal life shifted at the same time. In 1976, a year after starting over in Castle Hills, he married Diana Castro. The timing says something. He built a marriage in the middle of genuine uncertainty, while his new congregation was still counted in dozens, not thousands. He kept pushing anyway, adding services, expanding ministries, and slowly turning a tiny fellowship into something much larger. The next major leap came in 1987. The congregation, having long outgrown its storefront roots, relocated to a sprawling new campus on San Antonio's north side and took a new name that would become permanent: Cornerstone Church. This wasn't just a bigger building. It was a completely different scale of ambition, with room for a massive sanctuary, television production facilities, and large-scale conferences. In the years that followed, Cornerstone would claim more than 20,000 active members, making it one of the largest churches in Texas. A congregation that once fit in a living room had become a religious institution with national reach. Part 4. The empire expands: television, books, and a message about money. As Cornerstone grew, so did everything orbiting it. By the early 2000s, Hagee's ministry had become a full-scale media operation. Through Global Evangelism Television and John Hagee Ministries, his sermons reached an estimated 99 million homes worldwide, broadcast across more than 160 television stations and 50 radio stations. The small-town preacher's boy had become a genuinely global media figure, and the money followed the reach. Financial filings from the early 2000s pointed to an enterprise pulling in more than $18 million in annual revenue, with a personal compensation package that drew serious scrutiny. This wasn't a pastor with a large following anymore. This was the head of a religious brand with real financial weight behind it. His profile grew even further through publishing. By 2018, he was being described as a New York Times bestselling author with somewhere between 34 and 40 books to his name, 7 of which reached the Times list. Titles like For Blood Moons and Absolute Power among them. Writing gave him a second stage entirely separate from the pulpit, feeding into a broader identity that blended preaching, broadcasting, conferences, and politics into what commentators eventually just started calling a media empire. In 2011, he added music to the mix, releasing a Southern gospel album called A Lifetime of Music, featuring guest spots from the Oak Ridge Boys, Bill Gaither, his son Matthew Hagee, and the extended Hagee family group. The record earned 2 GMA Dove Award nominations, including one for the song Victory in Jesus. But at the actual center of his preaching set a message about wealth. And it's the piece of his ministry that's drawn the sharpest criticism of all. In sermons like The Power to Get Wealth and The Decision to Prosper, Hagee leaned on Deuteronomy 8, verse 18 to argue that prospering financially was God's explicit will for believers. He built a whole framework around the phrase, giver's gain, tying Luke 6, verse 38 to the idea that giving money away set material blessing into motion. In his telling, financial increase wasn't random. It was a direct result of generosity, obedience, and faith. He described poverty itself as a curse, and taught that believers didn't qualify for abundance until they'd given first. That teaching became one of the most contested parts of his entire ministry. Critics accuse him of using Scripture to justify a fundraising machine built on promised financial returns, a practice often labeled seed theology. Watchdog groups and online critics zeroed in specifically on how he applied Luke 6, verse 38 and Deuteronomy 28 in fundraising appeals, arguing the verses were being stretched to suggest that donations to the ministry would come back as personal wealth, healing, or breakthrough. Supporters heard hope and encouragement in that message. Critics heard something closer to manipulation. Scripture pulled out of context and repurposed as a sales pitch. Part 5. The ranch, the salary, and the questions about money. Personal wealth became its own controversy. Some online commentators claimed Hagee's net worth sat around $50 million, built almost entirely on donor giving. Other estimates, from both secular outlets and Christian watchdog groups, placed the real number closer to $5 to $6 million, based on salary, book royalties, and ministry-related income. Investigative reporting dug up harder numbers. Before a 2004 restructuring of part of his nonprofit operations, Hagee was reportedly among the highest-paid nonprofit executives in San Antonio, earning close to $1 million annually for what was described as limited weekly hours tied to the nonprofit. In 2001 alone, Global Evangelism Television reported more than $18 million in revenue on its IRS filings, and Hagee's total compensation that year came to nearly $1.25 million, roughly $540,000, as gets president, another $302,000 from Cornerstone Church directly, and more than $41,000 in additional benefits and retirement contributions. The San Antonio Express News went further, reporting that Hagee's retirement trust included a 7,969-acre ranch near Brackettville, Texas, valued at roughly $2.1 million, complete with 5 lodges, a gun locker, a skeet shooting range, and multiple barns. For critics, the contrast was impossible to ignore. A preacher promising financial breakthrough to his congregation from the stage, while living a level of comfort that stood in stark contrast to the poverty and hardship the New Testament apostles were known for. Part 6. Israel, End Times, and the sermons that wouldn't stay buried. Hagee's unwavering support for Israel wasn't really political. At its core, it was theological. He taught that the modern state of Israel functioned as a kind of prophetic stopwatch, ticking down toward the events that would precede the rapture. In his 2006 book, Jerusalem Countdown, he argued that conflict involving Israel, particularly a future confrontation with Iran, would ignite the Gog and Magog battles described in Ezekiel 38 and 39, pushing the world one step closer to the return of Christ. He went further, warning that any U.S. policy seen as weakening Israel could invite divine judgment on America itself. To him, these weren't political disagreements. They were prophecy with eternal consequences attached. He connected present-day events to that theology constantly and, at times, unsettlingly. In October 2014, during the Ebola outbreak, he warned his broadcast audience that America was drifting toward judgment because of diplomatic pressure on Israel regarding Jerusalem, framing the outbreak itself as possible evidence that judgment had already begun. That theology built real alliances. Wealthy political donors and prominent conservatives found common ground with his pro-Israel positioning. His organization, Christians United for Israel, held events honoring figures like Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, a clear picture of how theology, money, lobbying, and political strategy all fed into one another inside his world. By 2015, CUFI claimed 2.2 million pro-Israel households, and Hagee didn't hesitate to warn Republican candidates that a large share of those voters would make decisions based heavily on Israel policy alone. Yet many Jewish commentators pushed back hard, arguing that his framework treated Jewish people less as people and more as characters in someone else's end-time script. The deeper controversy, though, came from specific sermons that have followed him for decades. In the late 1990s, preaching on Jeremiah 16, a passage about God sending fishers and then hunters, Hagee made a comment that stunned even sympathetic listeners. He said God had sent a hunter, and identified Hitler as a hunter, describing a hunter as someone who forces you at gunpoint. The implication was that the Holocaust happened because God allowed it, since returning Jewish people to Israel was, in his framing, God's highest priority. To many, that interpretation came dangerously close to assigning a divine purpose to genocide. It didn't stop there. Hagee was also documented describing Hitler as descending from cursed, genocidally murderous half-breed Jews, tying the claim to the biblical figure of Esau, and constructing a narrative in which Jewish suffering flowed from disobedience toward God. For Jewish scholars and writers, that framing echoed centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes that blamed Jewish people for their own persecution. A similar pattern showed up in his teaching about global finance. In both books and broadcast sermons, Hagee repeated claims that the Rothschild family sat at the center of a private network controlling the Federal Reserve and the global financial system, weaving that idea into prophecy about a coming one-world government and the Antichrist. Critics were quick to point out that this drew directly from classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish bankers secretly controlling world finance. Those old sermons didn't stay buried. In May 2008, in the middle of a presidential race, audio of the Hitler sermon surfaced across political blogs and cable news. Within a day, Senator John McCain, who had welcomed Hagee's endorsement specifically to court evangelical voters, publicly rejected it, calling the remarks deeply offensive and indefensible. The political cost had simply become too visible to ignore. The same history resurfaced again on November 14th, 2023, when Hagee was invited to pray at the March for Israel rally on the National Mall. The event itself was meant as a public stand against anti-Semitism. But almost immediately, Jewish writers and commentators dug back up the Hitler sermon and the half-breed remarks, calling his presence on that particular stage nothing short of a moral disgrace. Part 7. The Culture Wars. Israel wasn't the only front. Hagee built a reputation for sharp, often blistering attacks on Catholics, Muslims, women, and LGBTQ+ people. For years, he described the Catholic Church as the great apostate church and a false cult system, at times suggesting a spiritual connection between Catholicism and Nazism. Under mounting pressure in May 2008, he sent a letter to Catholic League President Bill Donahue expressing regret over comments that had hurt Catholics, a letter the League ultimately accepted, even as Hagee maintained his original remarks had been misunderstood. His comments about Islam sparked a similar backlash. In a 2006 interview with Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air, Hagee said that those who live by the Quran have a scriptural mandate to kill Christians and Jews, a claim critics labeled outright Islamophobic for painting an entire global religion as inherently violent. On gender, Hagee preached a rigid, patriarchal vision of family life, teaching that women's core purpose under God was motherhood and domestic life. Critics argued this reduced women to a single narrow role while casting ambition, career, and public life as inherently suspect. His apocalyptic rhetoric turned especially inflammatory when different prejudices collided in the same sermon. At one point, He claimed the future Antichrist would be homosexual and partially Jewish, an idea that echoed his earlier claims about Hitler and Karl Marx both being half-breed figures. That same instinct to assign divine meaning to tragedy showed up again after Hurricane Katrina. In a September 2006 NPR interview, Hagee said the storm represented God's judgment on New Orleans, pointing specifically to a planned gay pride parade as evidence the city had crossed a moral line, framing a disaster that killed more than 1,200 people as divine punishment struck many critics as cruel, offering theological lessons instead of comfort to a grieving region. His political commentary followed a similar pattern. In November 2014, Hagee called Barack Obama one of the most anti-Semitic presidents in U.S. history, a claim that drew a rare rebuke from the Anti-Defamation League, an organization typically aligned with pro-Israel positions. Hagee later tried to walk it back, claiming he'd meant anti-Israel rather than anti-Semitic, but by then the original comment had already spread widely. Part 8. The Long Goodbye. In November 2021, Cornerstone Church hosted a stop on the Reawaken America tour, a hard-right political roadshow featuring figures like Michael Flynn and Alex Jones. Footage from inside the sanctuary showed hundreds of attendees chanting, "Let's go, Brandon," a coded jab at President Biden, amplified to the church's own sound system. The moment was enough to prompt the Freedom from Religion Foundation to formally ask the IRS to investigate whether the event had crossed a legal line for a tax-exempt church engaging in partisan politics. By this stage, age and health were catching up with him too. On October 4th, 2020, his son Matt Hagee told the congregation that his 80-year-old father had tested positive for COVID-19. Hagee spent roughly 2 weeks under hospital-level care before returning to preach in mid-November 2020. By 2023, reporting described him dealing with heart issues and the visible physical toll of decades in ministry, though he kept preaching under medical supervision through it all. Behind the scenes, succession was already underway. Matt Hagee had increasingly stepped into the role of lead pastor, while John remained the founding pastor and the symbolic face of the ministry, a structure that let the elder Hagee keep preaching and making major public appearances while day-to-day leadership shifted to the next generation. When John Hagee walked onto the stage at the March for Israel rally in Washington, D.C. on November 14, 2023, it took almost no time at all for 6 decades of arguments about his theology, his lifestyle, and his own words to resurface right alongside him. That's been a pattern for more than 60 years now. Every time the spotlight finds him again, the entire record rises back up with it. That's the story of John Hagee, the empire, the theology, and everything that's followed him through it. If you want more deep dives like this one, step into the vault for more. Subscribe to Lore Vault so you don't miss what's coming next.